Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the New Ground Life and Leadership podcast. Today, it's an absolute privilege to be joined by Andy Bannister. Dr. Andy Bannister, I should say. Dr. Bannister lives in Dundee, Scotland, and is the director of the Solar Centre for Public Christianity, which is an organisation based in Scotland that exists to persuasively communicate the truth about who Jesus is. He's also the author of 6 books. He's a keen hiker, a mountain climber, very masculine endeavour, as we've talked about, and a photographer. Andy, great to have you with us.
Yes, it's great to be on the podcast. Thank you for making me sound really like epic and manly, because I always think writing books is not really just exercising your fingers. But yeah, we have good outdoor pursuits here in Scotland. So yeah, I do the manly stuff as well.
And the nice thing is, Andy, you know, by laying that thought, throwing those words out there, saying that you're what did I say? A mountain climber, hiker,
yes,
etc. People will hear your voice and they'll now be picturing someone like Russell Crowe or.
Yes, because if they're not getting the video, that's it. Tell people I look like a combination of Russell Crowe and Bear Grylls combined. That's exactly it. And listeners, don't Google me, because that illusion will then be shattered.
Well, Andy, I'm excited today to be talking to you specifically about the whole subject of the environment and Christian and biblical responses to environmental concern or issues of environmental concern, which is an area that, by and large, it's probably fair to say these days Christians and the church isn't the leading voice in the debate and the discussion. In fact, it's often seen as being a hindrance to the discussion. And I'd love to tease open some of that as we get going. But I guess maybe as a first question to kind of open up the issue from a Christian point of view, or just someone who loves the environment and reads widely, how serious an issue is this, and how much responsibility should individual Christians feel towards the environment?
Oh, my word. Jez, there's a whole series of questions banged together. Well, let's start, I suppose, at where you ended. What response? You know, how should Christians think about this? I mean, what's amazing, right? If you look at the beginning of the Bible, when the very first very first chapter, really, God creates everything, and repeatedly after He creates the skies and the seas and the mountains and the land and the forests and the animals, God says it's good. Now, when He comes to humanity, He says it's very good. Humanity, we are the crowning glory of what God has made. But it's not as if God made us after He'd failed to make the earth and gone, oh, that's a load of rubbish. Let's get it right with human beings. So we know there is firstly, obviously, the way that God feels about the environment is shown right there. Then, of course, you look at what is said to Adam and Eve. They're told to care for and steward, to steward that earth. And the idea of stewardship is there. Now, sometimes that's been misunderstood. I think so much has gone wrong in Christian thought because we've understood stewardship to mean we can use the hell we like. But if I throw you the keys to my car and I say, Jez, you can borrow my Toyota, I've given you stewardship over my little Yaris. If you bring it back, covered in vomit, indented and scratches everywhere, and I said, oh, dude, what's happened? And you've gone, oh mate, you gave me stewardship. That's not enough of an answer. I think I'd want some explaining to do. And I think the same goes for creation. That theme runs through the scriptures, that God cares about this world that He's made. Jesus in John 3:16, very famous verse, God so loved the world. And of course, comes through to the end of the Bible. The whole vision for the Christian hope for the future is not that we will be, sucked out of this world and this world will be destroyed, but the new heavens and new earth. And somehow this creation is going to be restored and redeemed too, once God has dealt finally once and for all with all that's gone wrong with it. That's what the cross was about. It was something much, involved us in our sinfulness, but also all the damage that sin has wrought to us in creation. So creation is a massive biblical thing. But as you said in the intro, I think where things have gone wrong, Christians, although historically we were involved in the environmental movement, we got it into our heads that actually this was a kind of progressive, non-Christian, secular issue, and slowly the environmental movement and Christianity parted, actually I think to the detriment of both. And now I think there are two things going on. Firstly, of course, we have a lot of environmental concerns and issues right now. Yeah, there's climate change, that's talked about, but there's lots of other things. Plastic in the oceans is one of the big ones that I get really worked up about, because that's really obvious. Climate change, unless you are a scientist, we don't know everything that's going on there. You only have to walk the beaches and you see, you live on the coast, plastic everywhere. So there's those issues, but then also it's a huge issue for young people. I remember a couple of years ago, just before lockdown, doing a big event in London for Christian young people. We had about 1,500 people there, aged from, I think, 15 through to about mid-20s was the age range. We had open Q&A. They could submit questions using this online app. And I think over the day that we were there at Westminster Central Hall, we had about 500 or 600 questions come in. I would say the environment was probably the second biggest issue on that list. And so I think it is hugely important. Christian young people, I think, want to think this one through. And I know many non-Christians who, because they think the church doesn't care about the planet, are not willing to take Christian faith seriously. So I think it's time that we re-engage the conversation. Sorry, it was a very long answer to several brilliant questions tied together.
And you mentioned the plastics in the ocean. I came across on your website a quote by David Hartnett, who said that at current rates of disposal, by the time his 1-year-old grandson Caleb turns 21, there will be a larger total mass of plastic in the world's oceans than fish.
Yes, yeah, it's unbelievable when you look at those kind of stats. And as I say, this is one of the things that sort of slowly woke me up to environmental issues. So as someone who walks a lot, and I love the mountains, but I just love the beaches. As you walk the beaches of Scotland, you even go to some of the furthest flung bits of the Hebrides or the Orkneys or wherever to go where, there's not a lot of, outwardly human sort of development. Walk along the beaches, plastic all over the place. So you don't need to really be a scientist to go, we have a little bit of a problem here. And I think once you just constantly remind yourself that this is God's good world. One of my favorite hymns, not so well known over here, but there's that wonderful American hymn written by Maltby Davenport Babcock, great name they gave Americans in the late 1900s. This is my father's world. This is my father's world. It's amazing. If you've never come across it listening to this, Google the lyrics. It's a beautiful hymn. And once I think as Christians, we, as we go around this world, constantly reminding ourselves, this is my father's world. Some things I think follow from that.
Well, maybe just coming back to what you touched on at the start of your answer, the Christian response is that I think in a presentation I heard from you, you quote Neil Ansell, who's a non-Christian writer, but he describes what he calls a biblical outlook that sees the world solely as a resource for our benefit. And I think you then quote the megachurch pastor Mark Driscoll, who says that the world's going to burn one day. That's why I drive an SUV.
Yes.
Which, so can you speak into that? Why does someone like Driscoll make a comment like that? Why does someone like Ansell think that it's a biblical outlook to see the world solely as a resource?
Well, I quote those two because they're interesting, right? Because in one sense, you've got Neil Ansell, as secular journalist, and in his mind, it's Christians are just people who see the world there as something they can use for their own benefit. And when I first read that, I actually read that before I came across Mark's beautiful little soundbite, and he's not alone. I remember reading Neil's book, thinking, well, that's a bit unfair. Where does that come from? Then I thought, well, let's go do some digging, and you don't have to dig hard before you can find that. And I use. Mark in one sense is like, it's a bit like shooting fish in a barrel, finding him having said something a little bit unhelpful. But I think it sums up a bigger ethos, and that's there. This idea that the world is simply there for our benefit. And I think a number of problems, of course, flow from that. And I think the first problem is we touched on earlier. I think it's a massively twisted understanding of stewardship. That responsibility that God places to human beings. Stewardship has built into it the idea of care. Yeah, you can use resources. I absolutely believe the Bible is very clear that God has placed all kinds of things into the natural world for for human beings to use and enjoy, everything from the structure of the world itself with the seasons and agriculture and everything else and all the other things like that. But to do it in a way that destroys what you're using is, I think, deeply, deeply un-Christian, quite frankly, is the first thing. And then, as I say, I think secondly, is of course, the way that Neil then responds to that is, as somebody who is primarily wired to be an evangelist, my concern is that this then becomes a stumbling block for people. And it breaks my heart when I come across, and not just young people, I come across anybody really who cares about the environment and has therefore got it into their head that the Christian faith has nothing to say. And actually, I do a lot of talking on university campuses. And one of my favorite talks I do these days, Jez, is this one. I love doing this very topic. In fact, I was on the campus at St Andrews University 2 weeks ago for a mission week there. And this was one of the topics I spoke on. And it was quite fun, actually, because what I like to do is flip the script and sort of say, look, yeah, absolutely, Christians got some things wrong. But for my non-Christian friends, what I want them to hear is actually without the Christian faith, actually there is no basis for environmentalism, which is the irony. Because actually the ultimate outworking of atheism would be, well, the reason we need to look after the planet, really the best reason we have, is because it's useful to us. And you can see that in the environmental movement. A lot of environmental campaigns are based on that. We would be careful. We need to be wary about climate change, because that can cause sea level rise, which affects human cities. Well, hang on a moment. Is there not a better argument for caring for the environment in its own right, not just because it's useful to us? So it's actually not just Christian to make this argument. To which I then say, when I'm doing this evangelistically, to say the only argument I know that actually works when it comes to environmentalism is that this planet is God's good gift to us. And just as you would treat with respect and care, a present given to you by a loved one, by a parent or a spouse or a friend, you wouldn't just then, wreck it and destroy it. It'd be something seriously messed up with you. In the same way that if this world is God's good gift to us, that is a very powerful motivation for environmentalism.
That's very helpful. I want to carry on talking about the secular responses to the environment in a sec, but I just want to backtrack a bit, because something that strikes me, Driscoll's comment, is that rooted in an eschatology that sees that the world is going to just blow up and burn in the end, and so therefore, to use your illustration of the car, that only works if you're coming back for the car. But if you've said, have this car, run it into the ground.
Yes.
And actually, for a lot of Christians, they think God said, have the earth, run it into the ground, and we'll sort something out after all that. So can you speak into the eschatological issue?
Oh, there's a good word for a Tuesday morning, eschatology. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. I think Christian misunderstandings of the environment are based in actually three things. We're going to get really sort of clever, but we'll just chase down this one in a minute. You've got a faulty view of creation. I think you've got a faulty view of soteriology, what the work of Christ did, and then I think you've got faulty eschatology. So we've got faulty theology all across the map, and Driscoll represents all of those. But the eschatology, you're absolutely right. And to go, actually, I remember what's funny is I remember as a young Christian somehow picking up the idea that the role of the thing about Christianity was you gave your life to Christ, then you got your little golden ticket to heaven, a bit like the golden ticket in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, and then you go to heaven to be with Jesus when you die. And I can actually remember as a teenager, my big first crisis of faith was the question, okay, what the heck happens now? I'm 14 and I'm following Jesus. I might live till I'm like really old, like 50. Actually, now I'm 50. I think 80 is really old, but back then, and I literally remember thinking, well, surely the best thing that could happen is like I get run over by the number 13 bus to Putney or something, because then I go straight to be with Jesus. There's actually no point being here. And that's actually the logical outworking of that theology. And the thing that I think shows that Driscoll's theology is wrong all over the map is to go, if you grab Jesus or Paul and the first Christian said, okay, well, presumably I can abuse my body because I'm going to get a resurrection one anyway, right? To go, when I'm raised with Christ, I'm going to have a new body, so I can do whatever I like with this one. Well, Paul goes for that theology left, right, and center. He attacks that directly. I think Jesus would want nothing to do with that either, because that's actually not Christianity. That's actually an ancient Greek philosophy called Gnosticism. And in Gnosticism, the idea is that the material world is bad, and it's the spiritual world, the world of the mind and the spirit, that's good. And so matter is a disastrous thing. And that worldview, as you probably know, did huge damage in church history. Actually, it even played into some Christological heresies in the first few centuries, when there were some Christians who thought that Jesus couldn't really have become in the flesh because the flesh is bad, right? And so Driscoll is actually echoing that idea. If you've considered that actually our job is to escape this world into a world purely of spirit, then actually that's what you're basically saying. You're saying matter is somehow secondary. The New Testament, on the other hand, has this wonderful earthy spirituality. I mean, it begins, well, it's all over the Gospels, because Jesus was both God and man. He wasn't floating around pretending to be a human being. The resurrection accounts are fantastically earthy. Jesus, the people touch him and feel him. He eats breakfast. There's a physical quality to him. 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul talks about what the resurrection body will be like in the new heavens and the new earth. It's going to be physical. We'll have a physical quality to those bodies. And here's the interesting thing, Jez. There is a continuity between our physical bodies now and our resurrected bodies. So that the resurrected Jesus still had the wounds, still had the marks of the resurrection. The disciples could still see the nail marks. So there was a continuity there. Now, expand that from just us to creation, because the Bible does say less in the New Testament about the new heavens and the new earth, and it says about our resurrected bodies, but it does use the new heavens and new earth language. And you read Revelation 21, which is a beautiful picture of what the new heavens and the new earth will be like. In fact, with the New Jerusalem coming down to earth, and us living this life with God walking and talking with us again as it was in the beginning. Again, you have this kind of very physical quality to it. So I think there's a very earthy quality to New Testament spirituality that we miss if we're not careful. Because I think one of the mistakes we all make as Christians, all of us, not just Mark Driscoll, so we're not careful. We have our little theological framework that we were raised in. In my case, I was raised in particular church tradition, got this idea in my head, and you read the New Testament particularly through that lens, rather than reading what the text says. And the book, by the way, that changed my kind of thinking on this, that was just probably, if you're like me and you read kind of widely, do you have that experience when there are books that come along and you go, that book was just transformative? And one of the books that really helped me on this was Tom Wright, or N.T. Wright. He writes in both names depending on how academic he feels at the time. His book Surprised by Hope is a wonderful read, because it just really does a deep dive into what is the New Testament saying, what is the Christian hope. And yes, it's resurrection from the dead, but it's a physical resurrection, and it's a new heavens and it's a new earth. It's all of creation remade through the work of Jesus on the cross, because God's project is to get everything that is evil out of his good creation. And I think Mark, bless him, has just missed that. And the great thing is, God loves Mark Driscoll. Let's not just beat up on him. He's a brother in Christ, and I'm looking forward to the idea. I love the idea that he'll get quite a lovely surprise actually in the new heavens and the new earth, when Jesus may have a little word about Mark. It's so much more than you imagined.
That's very helpful, thank you. So there is a kind of a necessary reframing or repositioning of the Christian out of a tradition that would say Christianity is just about you getting your sins forgiven to go to heaven, and much more about understanding your position within creation as being an ambassador of God, and that actually God isn't going to just burn this whole thing up and say, never mind, let's start again. But as with our physical bodies, they're like the seeds of the next body, aren't they? And so that this creation, in that sense, is like the seed of the next creation that we should therefore care for and look after because of that. Is that a prime motivation for you as well?
Yeah, I think very much so. And I think I love the way you framed it there, Jez, as well, is that as you think that through, the implications are massive. Just as I discovered, as a teenager, that actually, it's not just about wanting to escape and be with Jesus. Once you become a follower of Jesus, it changes everything. And in fact, one of my other spiritual heroes, I know probably loved by many listening to this podcast, C.S. Lewis, probably if I was, stuck on a desert island and was only allowed to take one C.S. Lewis quote with me, it's that very famous one where he says, I believe in Christianity in the same way as I believe the sun has risen, not because I see it, but by I see everything else. And what he's getting at is when you become a Christian, become a follower of Jesus, everything changes. The gospel sheds light on everything, mathematics, history, art, literature, science, and our view of creation and the environment. Everything is changed by the light of the gospel. And that turns Christianity into just this sort of little ticket I get to go to heaven when I die, which is not unexciting, but it's so much more than eternal life. It's not less than eternal life. Let's be absolutely clear what we're saying. It's not less than that, but it's massively more than that. And I think the other thing I struggled with as a younger Christian, actually thinking back, there was a whole basket of things connected in with those early kind of struggles of faith. The other one I remember wrestling with when I was younger was the whole question of, will we get bored in heaven? And if you think heaven is just like a church service in the sky forever, I know that terrifies people. It terrified me. I meet Christians who actually talk to them who actually admit, I'm not sure I actually want to go. I love church on a Sunday, but for eternity. But you read the New Testament vision, it's so much bigger. New heavens, new earth, walking and talking with Jesus again to go, because he is eternal and infinite and we're not. We will never be able to outgrow him. And I think the more you look into this and press into this and read what the New Testament really says, it's just incredibly exciting. Christian faith becomes so much bigger and so much richer and so much more dramatic, which is what we should expect, because this is the God of the universe we're talking about. So it's fantastic. It got me excited to be a Christian again when I was about 17, 18.
Oh, that's good. I think there is a like the Gnostic problem where we think spiritual equals this invisible floatiness, rather than whereas actually Christianity is a much more holistic, embedded thing where
Yes.
this is essentially project 1.0 of God's created plan. I think when it comes to the new creation, that's 2.0, where actually everything that we've learned about stewarding and creation and God's activity, his creativity, we then implement to a greater extent in the new creation. So, but I think you're right.
And let me just add something very quickly on that, Jez. I actually think as well, this is a tangent we may not have time to go down, rabbit trail we may not have time to go down today, but I think Gnosticism has always been one of the number one enemies, if you could have more than one number, it's one of the top 5 enemies that Christianity has always battled. It's there in the beginning, and it's there today. And the place it turns up today, we've obviously talked about the temptation Christians have, to reject creation. That's I think a subversion of the gospel. But you look at one of the other big issues in our culture right now, the whole transgender movement. That is Gnosticism. That says, if in my mind I think I'm a female, but my body is male, we don't stop and think, well, maybe we need to work on the mind and bring the mind into line with the body. No, we hack the body to pieces because the mind wins. That's Gnosticism. That's the ancient Greek story all over again. Or another example is pops up in Islam. You mentioned my academic area is Islam. My last book, Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God. As I wrote the chapter on there in heaven, the Quranic view of what heaven is like is exactly that. Earth burns. As a Muslim, you want to escape there to go to the party in the sky, and it literally is wine, women, and song in heaven forever. In that kind of sort of spiritual realm upstairs, and they're going, well, that's a Quranic view, that's not a biblical view. And so Islam is the world's second biggest religion. Muslims are more and more a people group we need to think about reaching. And as I say, transgenderism, huge issue that Christians have to engage with. Both of them are deeply Gnostic ideas. So this Gnostic thing that we're talking about, you and I today, for those who are listening, it's not some mildly academic discussion. This is a key idea, and the Christian faith cuts right against it. Christianity and Judaism before it never embraced the idea that what matters is the spirit, and the world of matter is bad. That is not Christian. It is not biblical. It is a heresy. We need to name it for such.
That's great. Thank you for that. Now, let's just stay with that as well, because I think as well as our eschatology might be, or our heretical views of the body and creation might be informing us, how much as well do you think this is linked to our detachment from creation, post-industrialization, we might say, to use another big word, post-industrialization, where we feel so much more disconnected from the created world? I get my food from the shops rather than from the ground. And you mentioned in your presentation again, I found this very challenging. You said, if you can name more cars than you can trees, you've probably got a problem. And I confess, I think I can.
I use that example deliberately because I'm terrible at trees. I can name mountains, but I go for when I walk in the woods, I'm like, well, I think that's an oak. Oaks I can do. I can just about do oaks, but here in Scotland, we've got it seems like we've got a million varieties of fir tree. Is that a larch? Is that a Scots pine? I think a couple of things are going on. The other story I tell sometimes when I preach and teach on this, is a lovely illustration that I actually got from the British nature writer Robert Macfarlane, who tells the story that I think it was 2007 when the new edition of the Oxford Children's Dictionary came out. Lots of reviewers noticed that lots of words had been culled. Words like otter, fern, willow, various other things. Lots of words to do with nature had all gone. And in their place had come words like email, attachment, celebrity, and on it went. And there's an interview he cites with the head of Oxford Children's Dictionaries at Oxford University Press, who basically said, oh, well, we wanted the dictionary to reflect the experience of modern childhood. And Robert Macfarlane writes, he says, hasn't something gone profoundly wrong if we're raising a generation of kids who know what an email is, but don't know what an acorn is? And so I think something has happened. And then I think, of course, one of the knock-on effects, as I think as we get disconnected from the natural world, is that then we lose the connection to the God who made it, because the Bible brings those two things together. I mean, I love, Psalm 19, beautiful example of that. The heavens declare the glory of God. That's one of my favorite Psalms, talking about literally the way that creation is singing and praising God. I'm a big Tolkien kind of fan, and not most years I read through Lord of the Rings. In fact, this year I'm going to get to do it twice because my son turned 7 this year, and I promised him we'll read it together, and I'm just finishing it myself. If anyone who knows Lord of the Rings, of course, I love that Tolkien, who was profoundly Christian, took a lot of those nature themes and baked them right in. So if you know your Lord of the Rings, in the Two Towers, of course, you have the Ents, you have Treebeard and the Ents. So he literally took those, in Tolkien talking about that, took that imagery of the trees of the field clapping their hands and sort of played with what would happen if that was real, and that nature actually is, got something to say. And so I think, yeah, we miss out on that. And I think for reasons you say, we live in a very industrial age where we can just go to the store and get whatever we want. I was about to say turn on the heating, but actually if Putin has his way, that might not be the case. But, other than that, and then, of course, the other thing we do, which I find fascinating, is that one thing I've noticed, Jez, I don't know if you've noticed this too, that there's a lot more talk about the environment today, but we talk about it in quite a detached way. I mean, if I meet people, I meet students banging on about the environment, and I'll just say, oh, so when did you last go for a walk in the hills? Well, I've never been for a walk in the hills. Oh, okay. Well, it's great that you care about the environment. That is actually, brilliant. But why not get out and enjoy it? Because the number of studies that have been cited showing that the benefits to mental health and whatnot, if you get out into the natural world. And then for Christians, I don't know about you, I know you were sort of chatting before we were recording, you said you run and stuff because you're down there on the south coast. I find that when I'm out walking in nature, I find it much easier to think about the things of God, to pray. I find praying outside much easier than sitting in the four walls, because there's that point of connection. It's much easier to recite Psalm 19 outside on a starry night than it is sitting inside where you can't see the heavens declared glory of God. So yeah, I think a whole number of reasons we've become detached, and yeah, technology is also part of it. I guess actually we become addicted to the little black mirrors of our phones and our tablets, and forgotten that actually, why worry about 4K HD when you can just walk outside and look at the view and go, actually that's much better than 4K. Quite frankly. So yeah, there's a whole series of things that we've become detached.
Yeah, I think there's another favorite C.S. Lewis quote of mine that I often think of when I'm outside, and that is that I can't remember the exact quote, but the trees aren't glorious in themselves, but they give me an idea of what glory is. And actually you learn a lot more about God and glory and majesty and holiness by looking at the grandeur of his creation. So actually the church becomes slightly more malnourished if it just lives in apartment blocks or stares at computer screens, rather than, like you said, getting out, learning to pray in creation. Just on that as well, do you think that there's part of the challenge that we refer to it as nature more than creation? I know it's only a word, but does that change our relationship with it?
I think it might, but it's funny you say that, because I definitely agree with you, and we have to watch it ourselves as Christians, because if you're not careful, the word nature implies that it's sort of something it's in and of itself, rather than a creation requires a creator. But what I find fascinating is the number of nature writers I read who are not Christians, who are they're not dyed-in-the-wool atheists, but they're just sort of neutral, I suppose, agnostic, whatever. They sort of glide into spelling nature with a capital N. And one of the things I've noticed over the years was I began doing a lot more nature writing, was that spirituality pops up everywhere. So Robert Macfarlane, who I mentioned earlier, I think one of the UK's greatest nature writers living right now. Amazing, his books on the natural world. The beauty of his prose is something else. But he'll occasionally almost stumble into worship without realizing he's doing it. Or here in Scotland, one of the most famous Scottish nature writers was a lady called Nan Shepherd, wrote a book Upon That Mountain, a book on the Cairngorms. She does end up in Eastern spirituality. Now, it's easy to look at her and go, oh, she goes a Buddhist. If Nan were alive today, I'd love to have that conversation with her. But it's the fact she can't remain secular. Nature starts getting spelt with a capital N, because I think, we see that connection there. And you mentioned Lewis. Lewis is interesting, for a number of reasons. Of course, I find him fascinating because he was an atheist for the first 30 years of his life and becomes a Christian through this experience of joy and wonder that he finds not just in the natural world, but in the literature he loves. But one of my other favorite bits of Lewis is he wrote a little essay called A Meditation in a Tool Shed. And it's fresh in my mind because I've just written my next book, and I borrow Lewis's shed. And Lewis talks about this experience of standing in a shed in the garden on a sunny day, but there's no windows in the shed and the door's shut, so you're there in the dark. And he said, you notice though, there's a crack at the top of the door. And coming through the crack at the top of the door is a beam of light, shaft of light coming down through in the darkness of the shed. And Lewis says you can do a number of things with that beam of light. You can sort of look at it and go, oh, it's very pretty, very nice beam of light. If I was an artist, I might draw it, or a poet, I might write about it. Or he said, you can sort of turn yourself and align your eye so you look up the beam, and then you'll see through the crack in the door, you'll see the trees waving outside, and then 93 million miles away, you'll see the sun in the sky, the source of the light. And Lewis says the same thing applies to beauty in nature, beauty in arts, that we can look at the beauty, we can look at the view, the mountain view, and the river, the seascape, the sunrise, and go, oh, isn't it beautiful? And we can stop there, or we can look up the beam and go, where do all these things point? And then he adds, I think, it's not the beauty and the wonder and the joy are not in the view and the beauty and the natural world itself, but those are the channels through which it comes. What we need to do is look along it to the source. And I found that a really interesting conversation starter, actually. People who love the outdoors, you're standing on a mountaintop, admiring the view with someone you just met on the summit, to sort of raise that question of going, hey, have you ever wondered, why is it we are drawn to natural beauty like this? What brings us here? What causes a man or a woman to drag their backside up a mountain and expend sweat and blood and tears, or to run 5Ks to look at the view of the ocean or whatever? What is it? There's something there. And part of our job as Christians, I think, is to point up the sunbeam and say, maybe this is pointing somewhere.
Yeah, wow, that's so good. I love that quote. And actually, there's something about learning to read creation, isn't it, and see it as a tool for prayer. I think there's books recently, like the book The Liturgy of the Ordinary, and Andrew Wilson's written a book, the God of All Things. That actually learning to see the things in the created world as tools to teach us about God is something that we can recover as well. Well, let's come on to just talk about some of the secular responses so far, and where you think that they might be lacking, and where you think actually Christianity and the gospel has got something better to offer. And actually, Andy, I have to confess, I've just noticed that my laptop's not plugged in. I've got 10% battery, so I'm just going to grab my charger, if that's all right.
Sounds good.
Sorry, I'll give you a few minutes to prepare. Well, I just go and grab it.
Yeah, go for it.
Great, sorry about that. I'm back with you.
No problem.
Over to you.
Yes, I forget the last question. I don't think you ended on a question, though. I think you just...
I know, it's come on to talk to us about the different secular responses to the environment issue and where they lack compared to the Christian one.
Brilliant. Okay, yes, exactly. So I was talking earlier, I think, about how, I'll often speak around this theme when I'm doing, evangelism events or on university campuses. And the crux of, well, there are two cruxes. One of the crux is that I pivot that talk on is say, well, we all agree, and particularly when talking to younger audiences, we all agree there are environmental challenges, plastic in the oceans, deforestation, climate change, the list goes on and on and on. What's interesting, though, is then you ask the question, okay, why should I care? Why should I give a flying monkeys about the environment? That's what my friends put it. Now that's interesting. In fact, actually, one of my friends he's a fellow evangelist, a guy called Michael Otts, and I know you've been listening to Pod of the Gaps a bit, so he's also a co-presenter on that podcast that we do. Tells a lovely story of he was traveling once through Europe about 3 years ago, somewhere in Hungary, going somewhere, got chatting to a student who was in the same compartment on the train, and they were going to be over 6 or 7 hours on this train where it was going. And he just, found out he was a student, asked what he was studying. This guy was studying environmental science. And so Michael just said, oh, why are you studying that? And the guy said, well, I think it's really important given the environmental challenges the world faces. And Michael said, well, what kind of challenges? And this guy said, and listed a few. And then Michael just said, well, but why should we care? And it's interesting. He said, the look on the guy's face was a total picture that anybody could even ask. And he thought about it. He said, well, because we should. And Michael went, yeah, I agree we should, but why should we? And he said, it didn't take many why questions before the guy ran into a roadblock. I think the secular environmental movement is the same. When you start asking the why questions, there are a number of things that have been tried. I mean, one thing is tried, I think we mentioned it briefly earlier. One answer that secular environmental movements, the movement has often made, is to say, well, it will benefit us. We don't want sea level rise, it will flood human cities and so on. And well, the problem there, of course, A, that's profoundly selfish, and B, presumably bits of nature that don't benefit us are fair game, quite frankly. Any species or insect that has no instrumental value to human beings, well, basically we can, it's toast. So that doesn't seem to work. Emotion is another thing that's tried. So sometimes you'll find guilt is deployed. So Greta Thunberg is probably the queen of this approach, who is very, very good at trying to make everyone feel guilty. And so forth, so that you can take that approach, or you could take the positive approach and you can appeal to compassion. Think of a number of environmental campaigns that are often fronted by cute animals, chugging on the heartstrings. Sammy the seal, is going to, or sort of Patrick the polar bear. Notice the ugly animals never get the gig. You never get sort of frogs, or on those posters. It's always I think it's the kittens and the seals and the polar bear cubs have got that campaign set up. But again, it's filled to emotion. And the problem there, I say to people, is of course emotion is a terrible basis for anything, because what if you don't feel the emotion? What if Greta rants at you and you go, I don't care. Doesn't work for me, mate. You can't go any further, and I think that's a huge problem. Other campaigns have tried the appeal to future generations. I think again Greta's used this one, and Greenpeace have used this one. We should care for the planet because what about future generations? And that works to an extent. But what do you say to somebody who says, well, actually, I don't plan to have kids? We have friends who plan not to have kids. In fact, if you look at birth rates in the UK, the birth rate is dropping precipitously. I think partly because people look at the world around and go, well, who wants to have children? And of course, then what do you say to somebody who says, well, quite frankly, I don't worry about future generations. I'm not planning to make any. And again, you run, and then my favorite one I've seen of late, in terms of, I think 10 out of 10 for effort, but minus several hundred for effectiveness. I did see a campaign a couple of years ago that was based on, we should care for the natural world because we have a lot in common with it. So, we share 98% of our, that was it. It was a campaign to help save the great apes. We share 98% of our DNA or something like that with the great apes, and therefore we should care. Sounds lovely until you realize that, we have carbon atoms in common with tables, and we share 60% of our DNA with bananas. And I don't think I have a moral imperative or duty to bananas or to tables. And behind all those campaigns, I think, show that the secular environmental movement has lost its way, because when it began, environmentalism was profoundly Christian movement. We were chatting before the recording began, I think, Jez, and saying, one of my favorite books on this in the last 10 years or so, Mark Knoll, I think it was, out of the US, wrote a book called Inherit the Holy Mountain, where he traces the history of the American environmental movement. And all the founding fathers and mothers of that movement were either Christian or deeply Christian influence. So John Muir, who basically founded the National Park movement, and that then influenced the National Park movement over here. He was a Presbyterian, Scottish Presbyterian, who emigrated with his family to the States, and deeply influenced by that stream of Christianity. Lost his way a little bit in the middle of his life, became a bit sort of into things like transcendentalism and sort of New Agey ideas, but then at the end very much swings back to Orthodox Christianity. But Christianity was in his very bones. And when you hear him preach about the environment and why the government needed to protect what is now the national parks, it sounded like someone thundering from pulpit. Or Rachel Carson, whose book Silent Spring arguably kick-started the modern environmental movement. Again, raised in a Christian family, went to a Christian college, and again, although she perhaps wandered from her faith and her roots, in adult life, all of the foundations were there. And then actually the same is true over here. No one's written that book for the UK, but the National Trust. Many of the early trustees were Christians. In fact, there was an Anglican minister, wasn't there? Canon Rawnsley was one of the founders of the National Trust. And I think what happened, of course, those first Christian men and women who did all that work believed that was the outworking of their Christian faith. When in the environmental movement and Christianity then drifted apart, I think both lost out. We've talked earlier about how Christianity has lost out because we've been tempted to flirt with Gnosticism and very strange, theologies that are not Christian. But then the environmental movement has lost out because it's lost that ability to connect to people's hearts and say the reason that we care about these issues is this is my Father's world. And in fact, one of my great friends is a Mennonite Christian in the States called Nathan Rittenhouse, and Nathan and I have spoken together on these topics, in the States when I lived in Canada. And I love the Mennonite tradition he comes from, because it's very connected to the environment, because a lot of them are in farming and agriculture. I mean, him telling me a story, I mentioned right at the top of the podcast, Jez, that hymn that's not so well known over here, "This is my Father's world," and the first line of which is, "This is my Father's world, and to my listening ears all nature sings, and round me rings the music of the spheres. This is my Father's world, birds their carols raise, the morning light, the lily white declare their maker's praise. This is my Father's world, I rest in me the thought of rocks and trees and skies and seas, his hand the wonders wrought." And the other two verses are equally good. That hymn been hugely influential, by the way. The tune for it was used by Howard Shore in the soundtrack for Lord of the Rings. So if you go and watch Lord of the Rings movie, the Hobbit theme from that is actually that hymn reworked. But anyway, Nathan tells me the story of his grandfather. He remembers as a kid growing up, as they were going for walks in the countryside, if his grandfather saw a bit of litter by the side of the road, his grandfather would just say, quietly but audibly, "This is my Father's world, bend down, pick it up, carry on." And put those two things together, the sense is my Father's world, and put Christianity and environmentalism back together, and amazing things can happen. And so to Christians listening to this, which is probably the majority of the audience, I say we need Christians not to run away from environmentalism. We need to run into it. We can't let our secular friends take our toys and walk off with them, take our ball and walk off the pitch with it. And to go, what an amazing opportunity. And I think there's an evangelism opportunity here, as well as a creation care opportunity. If Christians were known as people who cared for the environment, and we're known actually as people who care for the poor, I think we have that reputation, but we should also be known as people who care for God's good earth and are not shy about how we do it. Don't just, for folks listening to this, don't just get involved in local branch of whatever, local footpath association or something, and don't say why you do it. Tell your non-Christian friends when you go out and do those kind of things why you do it. But bring your theology and the environment back together again. Sorry, that was a very, very long answer to a brilliant question.
That was superb, and you're absolutely right. There's just getting involved again, but from a position and posture of worship and gratitude for all God's gifts to us, rather than falling into the trap of so often just repeating the arguments of the world. It's very hard to watch any nature documentary without feeling guilty. I sit there feeling very guilty, enjoying my gas central heating, while David Attenborough tells me about how terrible I am, and I think, it crushes, it produces feelings of inertia and inadequacy in the scale of the problem. Whereas actually for the Christian to approach this from a posture of worship and gratitude for all that God's given us, actually worship and joy is the fuel of the Christian life. It's the fuel that keeps us going long beyond all the moral arguments.
Absolutely. And by the way, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the whole sort of fear and piece as well. Is going, again, this is a rabbit trail we won't go down, but it is worth flagging up that we live in a culture that's fueled by fear. It's fear about climate change, fear about COVID. Now it's fear about Russia and Putin and everything. And going, Christians have got to be people who do not give in. The number of times the New Testament, tells us not to fear. Do not fear. Be people of hope. First Peter, one of my favorite, little books in the New Testament, is full of that theme. And I think, we need to be people who are real and realistic. We don't stick our heads in the sand and go, what environmental problems? But we go, we don't need to fear. We don't need to fear, because you say, based upon worship and what Christ has done for us, we can be people of confidence and people of hope, but also people of action as well.
That's really helpful. Actually, just a friend of mine, I was listening to him yesterday. He was saying that when Christians use the language of fear, they're falling into the trap of the way the secular world speaks. Actually, when it came to COVID, our rationale in the responses that churches took was never fear. It was always love for our neighbor. But if it becomes fear, then you've lost actually, because we're supposed to be fearless. The same with creation. If we're involved with creation care because we're afraid of the future, then actually we've lost something. It's supposed to be joy and delight in what God's given us. I'd love to get your comment, if you may, on some of the more what gets labeled as some of the more progressive aspects of creation care, and why perhaps some conservative pastors might not instantly jump at it because it feels like a secular progressive agenda rather than a Christian one. But I'd like to get your comments on veganism, if I can. Here's the question.
I could hear the phone lines lighting up.
Is veganism vegetarianism? Is it, here we go, demonic influence and deceiving spirits, or is it responsible Christianity?
Oh my goodness. Or could it be neither, actually, is interesting. One way of cutting the Gordian knot. I'm always suspicious when people give me two alternatives and go, is it this or this? And I like to
very well trained
be a contrarian. I like to go, maybe it's neither. Yes. Yeah, to go, it's like I'm just conscious, of course, for many people, this is a very emotive issue. It's like the old joke, isn't it? How do you know if someone's a vegan? Well, they'll tell you. And yeah, whenever I speak on this topic, I'll invariably get this if we do Q&A. Someone will raise their hand and sort of try and fly a flag for veganism. Let's start with the other way you phrase it. Is it a kind of demonic, kind of problematic ideology? I love the New Testament's got such practical wisdom, right? Because Paul talks about this in both, I think, Corinthians and Romans, actually, from memory, where whatever you eat unto the Lord. So if you're somebody who feels that you want to be step away from meat or whatever, that's fine, but don't turn that into an idol in its own right, and don't go around beating up fellow Christians who think differently to you. Conversely, if you are a red-blooded omnivore like myself, you are not going to get sausages out and steak out of until my cold dead hands to go. It's equally not right for me to go around beating up on people who have taken different food choices. So I think that on this issue particularly, it's hugely important we take those words in the New Testament seriously, that we are brothers and sisters in Christ is what unites us, not our eating preferences and so forth. But anyway, let's press a bit harder into the issue though. You will hear people say that Christians should consider perhaps more strongly veganism and vegetarianism because it's more ethical, it's better for the planet, or all those things. Like all these things, being a little bit contrarian, I always think it's good to ask the why question. Why is it? Because take vegetarianism and veganism to go, one of the problems with that, if you're not careful, is if you would so easily assume that, well, I just make that lifestyle choice, cut the meat out, and then I can eat what I want. Actually, there are some huge implications to the planet in those lifestyles. My wife and I, my family and I, we have some friends of ours who are vegans. They sort of consume quite a lot of avocado. And I remember sort of gently pointing out, you do know that the carbon footprint on that particular fruit or vegetable, I'm never quite sure which it is, whichever it is. And then I remember Googling somewhere, looking at, because I knew there was a stat involved here. The amount of water that goes into producing an avocado is huge amounts. In fact, it's one of the most water thirsty crops you can possibly imagine. And so actually that's got a horrific implication. Or palm oil is the other one. A number of sorts of, vegan products and vegetarian products that if you Google the list of ingredients will have palm oil or soya. Almonds actually are bad as well. And you look at the way those are grown. My sister-in-law lived in California for some years, and you look at what monoculture production of almonds has done to the Californian, water table. It's horrendous. So it's not as straightforward as that. And on the other side of the equation, I mentioned my Mennonite friend earlier. He comes from a family of, sort of beef farming farmers. And Nathan, if he were here, would say, absolutely, if you go clear cutting in the Amazon to grow beef, horrendous. On the other hand, the part of America he lives in the hill country, nothing will grow. Grass is the only thing they've got. And in which case, raising a cow on that landscape is actually the most environmentally friendly thing you can do. It's actually a good use of the resources. And I think put those two things together, Jez, and my conclusion that I draw from that is we should be responsible consumers. Whatever we consume, we should think about our food choices. If you're a meat eater, think about animal welfare. Don't buy the cheapest, nastiest meat you can from Tesco's, even though the chicken's been battery farmed, and horrendous food, environmental, animal rights, animal justice issues. On the other hand, don't simply sit there thinking you're a vegan and you've got a free pass and you can, chow down whatever you like and not worry about, the landscape implications. Or, we're more aware now of fair trade issues, the way that, farmers are paid in the global south, and so on. So I think the challenge with that answer, of course, it means we will have to do work. And I think we like simplistic answers in the churches anywhere else. We like to think, well, okay, if I just eat this, I'll be all right. But I wonder if the Christian answer is actually no, we need to do justice and love mercy, walk humbly with our God. And what does that look like when we apply that to what's on our plate? And that would equally have a knock-on effect for things like overconsumption, right? In the West, where the amount of calories we consume compared to the rest of the world. Can we think responsibly about our choices?
Yeah, you mentioned elsewhere about the amount of energy per person Do you have
Oh,
that
gee,
stat
yes.
to hand? Yeah.
I forget the figure now. Someone's worked out. I think, if you sort of imagine energy consumption as weight, I think the average Westerner, consumes, 100 times what somebody in the global South would consume. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that necessarily. You can't. I don't believe in feeling guilty for where you live, but you can raise some questions about, arguably one of the, plastic in the ocean piece has been caused by our disposable culture here in the West, that we will easily throw things away. My wife's uncle is hilarious. I mean, he's in his late 70s, possibly even 80s now, and I love going and visiting them because he repairs anything. So like their toaster went wrong, and he went, I refuse to give in to this consumer culture. So he's an engineer by training, so he'd taken his toaster apart and was carefully repairing it because he said, well, and they're committed Christians. And I think if Don were here, he'd say that's the Christian view of stewardship, of going, I'm not going to throw this thing out, even though it was engineered to last 3 years and I buy another one. I'm actually going to repair it and reuse, recycle. This kind of idea. And it comes, all of these threads take us back to where we were with C.S. Lewis, right? The gospel sheds light on everything, and it should shed light on our consumption, which is interesting. And in fact, I mentioned in some writing I've done on this topic, so I know you've noodled around my stuff on this. For one book that was very influential to me was J. Matthew Sleeth's book, Serve God, Save the Planet. Second edition, I think that book is out now. And Matthew's book is interesting because he may be retired now, but he was a doctor in the States, so earning quite a high salary, and his family lived in a quite huge home. And as he began pressing into these issues, felt increasingly convicted to downsize, and he and his family lived it out. They put their money where their mouth was, and they downsized their house and tried to live a much simpler life. And it's interesting, right? There was a time when simplicity was one of the classic Christian virtues, right? If you the author's name escaped me, it'll come back to me, but spiritual discipline.
Yeah.
No, Spiritual Disciplines. I was thinking of that classic book on spiritual disciplines by it's gone completely. It will come back to me. I'm getting brain fog. Anyway, the classical spiritual disciplines, prayer, meditation on scripture, solitude, those kind of things that Christians for millennia practiced. Simplicity was one of them. But when was the last time you heard a sermon on simplicity? Is an interesting question, because our age has sold us this idea that we need to consume, and lots of things flow from that, and it's challenging. And by the way, don't hear me sitting here going, well, I figured it all out, we're living this way, we got it sorted, listen to me. I would say I'm struggling with these things as much as those listening to the show, but I think we start by asking. We've got to be people who ask the questions, haven't we?
That's very helpful, thank you. So maybe following that thread slightly, what would be some of your advice to church leaders? Should we be preaching on this regularly? You mentioned spiritual disciplines. Do preachers need to make sure they're getting people like yourself in to speak on the environment? Do they need to be making sure they're speaking on it regularly? How do churches not appear to be burying their head in the sand, and how do they equally avoid the self-righteous smugness that might come from other parts of the
community? Oh, it's truth. Yes, avoid the self-righteous smugness whatever you do, because that's the other thing that I think infects the environmental movement. I remember being a very early adopter and driving a Toyota Prius, and I used to joke to friends that it runs on smugness, because you drive a Prius down the road and rabbits would wave at you as you went by, kind of thing. So I think the first thing I'd say is, I think church leaders should be preaching on, as part of the regular preaching of the church, preach on the issues of the day. I was struck by on Sunday, the church that we attend here in Dundee. We're very careful. This is not a criticism, because we love our church, but I was struck by the fact that we've got the Ukraine crisis kicking off. Lots of people terrified about what's going on in the world, and we just carried on the sermon series through some eclectic bit of the Old Testament. I remember sitting there thinking, I just wonder if the church at times needs to be willing to go, this is the big issue, whether it's Ukraine, or whether it's the environment, or whether it's, faith and science, whether it's suffering, COVID, right? Raise those questions, because I think we need to be showing people, both Christians and those in our churches who are, on the outside, who've come because they're thinking about Christian faith but not committed to Christ. How do we show them that the Christian faith has something to say to these issues? And that's there all over the New Testament. Jesus did that. Paul did that. The church through history has always done that. I think in the modern world we perhaps have slightly forgot how to do that. I can remember as a young Christian, a book that was a huge influence on me, John Stott's Issues Facing Christians Today, classic book, really helpful. So I think for pastors listening to this, preach around the issues. So don't just preach on the environment, but what are the issues? And if you're not sure, great opportunity, ask your congregation. In fact, sometimes one great way of finding this out, the way I found these issues out, to be honest, I mentioned this at the start, Jez, is doing Q&A. And so, I think it's a great opportunity for churches to go do regular Q&A nights where you can say to the church members, come, bring your friends, any question of any kind, no matter how hostile, whatever, is welcome. And you start doing that as a church, you will find what it is that people are thinking around. And then you can use that to inform, okay, when I'm preaching and teaching, be thinking about this. First thing. Secondly, preach the whole of the scriptures. All of us, I've noticed that every denomination, we have our favorite passages and books, right? So right now, I'm a denominational gypsy. Whenever we've moved, we've just found a church where the gospel's preached and gone. So I've been Baptist, Anglican, Brethren, FIEC, you name it. Right now we're in a Presbyterian church because it was where we knew most people in Dundee. And so for the Presbyterians, probably the Book of Romans is our favorite book. Regularly big sermon series through that. Other churches, it's other things. Interesting as a pastor to ask yourself, where are the places I tend to lean in scripture? How can I, to quote Borum, who I quoted you earlier, how can I sample infinity in my preaching? Because if you preach the whole of scripture and you work through it regularly, maybe you'll find those themes that you wouldn't normally come across. And I say creation is all over the scriptures, but sometimes if we're too selective, we might miss it. So listen to the issues, preach the whole of the scriptures. And then I think the way that we avoid sounding sort of smug or shrill. I had a shrill for or against, because you'd be smug against. I've heard sermons, well, think of Mark Driscoll, where we just take pops at our friends outside the church. Look at them banging on about these issues. Show how all issues connect to Christ, because I think every issue does connect to Christ. And the way I do it on the environmental issue, by the way, and if you've listened to some of my stuff, so you'll see how I do this, is there's a wonderful quote by an environmentalist in the States I came across some years ago. I've got that mind blank there. I remember the quote, but I forget the writer. It will come back to me. Who talks about the fact that he's an environmental activist, was the advisor to the Obama presidency on environmental issues. And he famously says that, when he began in climate science, he said, I used to think that the greatest environmental challenges facing the world were, climate change, deforestation, species loss. I thought that 30 years of really good science could solve those issues. He said, I now realize that I'm wrong, actually. And the greatest environmental challenges are greed, selfishness, and apathy. And to solve those, we need a spiritual and we need a spiritual transformation, and we scientists don't have the first clue how to do that. And when I came across that, and the guy who said that is not a Christian, I'm coming across that, thinking to myself, well, that's interesting. And that's the turn to the gospel, the environmental issue, that the chief environmental challenges are heart issues. That when we discover that relationship with Christ, and that process of us becoming new creations begins in us, that should then work out in how we treat one another and in how we treat the world that God has made. So on all those issues, Jez, I would say what you want to be doing is then, connecting them into the cross. That's how we keep humble, because if we keep the cross in our focus, it doesn't let us become arrogant. The gospel doesn't let us do that. It's the great leveler, because I read, the gospel tells me, the cross tells me that, I'm greedy, I'm selfish, I'm apathetic. Thankfully, God still loved me enough to die for me in the person of Jesus, but also it means I know that as I follow him and as I, pray and allow the Holy Spirit to do his work in me, those are the issues I want to see God work on. And then I need to be asking myself, as a disciple of Christ, how do I, challenge those things when I see them wreaking havoc in society? So yeah, keep it Jesus focused as you preach through the issues to the cross.
That's so helpful. Thank you. I really, really appreciate that. So as you're speaking, I'm thinking of members of my church who've started startups, small businesses, or social campaigns to encourage people to be much more conscientious with their consumption habits and the products that they're using. And I think to encourage members of our congregation who are doing that, but as you said, to make sure we're always keeping it linked to the cross, and perhaps, to go back to earlier comments, making sure that this remains an issue of worship and joy as well, that we are delighting in God's creation and we're behaving as good, ambassadors of God in the world, and the way that we live and consume responsibly. I think that's a really helpful answer and really fascinating comment. Yeah, you're right about how church leaders, we can often be very keen on our plans that we've made, and we don't often let the current issues infect our plans. We think, oh no, we're just going to talk about this. People don't need to know about a Christian response to conflict. They just need to know about justification by faith from Romans. And there's a real helpful pushback and challenge there to make sure we are, because of course the opposite is true as well, that it's not as though Christians are hearing a silence on the issues, fear and media, and David Attenborough and Greta Thunberg, they are preaching to the saints all the time as well. And you mentioned the issues of culture like trans. People are hearing a steady stream of ideology, and what they need to hear is how it connects to the gospel. So I think it is a massive responsibility on church leaders to not duck these issues.
I think so. And I think that was one of the reasons myself and a couple of mates started the Pod of the Gaps podcast, was that sense that there are those gaps. And I love the way you put it there. Yeah, the world is speaking on these issues, and particularly, I've had such a heart for young people and students. A lot of my ministry is engaging those audiences, other audiences too, but those audiences. And it just breaks my heart when I've come across Christian students who've walked away from their faith, other non-Christians who've totally thrown the gospel out off as a possibility because they think Christianity has nothing to say on those issues. And also, I know, because I teach and train on this stuff, I can absolutely guarantee, for those who are pastors listening to this, that sitting in your church on a Sunday are people who are sitting there thinking about, Monday morning, I have to go into the workplace, and the issues my colleagues are throwing at me is not, how do I understand the meaning of that Greek word in Romans 13? That is not unimportant. Don't give me a saying that is not unimportant. But again, we have to show how it applies. And that, of course, if we look back through church history, is where the church really took off. The first few centuries, when even under heavy persecution, the church grew like wildfire because the first Christians took the message of Jesus, they took it seriously, but then they lived it out. And people saw the difference that it made. It saw how, Christians were some of the sharpest minds engaging with the issues of their day. And people are like, wow, I want to give this Jesus guy a look. And I think so we've got a great legacy here of men and women of Christian faith down through the centuries. We've got great people today, by the way. Don't hear me as saying, today we're all a load of, because I don't believe in beating up on the church, but we do have some work to do. And I think it's an exciting opportunity, because when you do that, I see the difference that it makes. I have many sort of friends from different backgrounds who come to faith in Christ, and the beginning of their story was, the light bulb going on, as it were, and seeing that actually Christianity had something to say here. And so I think, hugely important. So let's not abandon preaching the scriptures, but let's also weave the two together. One of my big heroes in all this, by the way, I've mentioned several, a great example of how you can do this today, of course, and a name known to many of us, I think Tim Keller. I think one of the reasons why Tim has been so effective, you look at the story of how, God grew Redeemer Presbyterian, is that was his model of going, okay, how do I preach the scriptures? He's good Presbyterian stock. Those guys know their Bible. But then how do you also bring the issues in? I remember reading an interview with him where he said before they planted Redeemer Presbyterian, he spent a year just walking the streets of Manhattan, drinking in the cafes, talking to anyone he had met, listening. What were the issues? What were people concerned about? What were the questions people had? And then when they launched and planted the church, those were the things that we made sure that we talked about regularly and show that the gospel and Jesus have something to say to those issues. And the result was it took off like wildfire.
Wow. It's so helpful, Andy. I'm so grateful for everything you've said today. You mentioned several things and books and things that you've read, which we'll put in the description to today's episode so people can find out more about them. You mentioned your podcast as well, Pod of the Gaps. Why don't you tell us a bit more about where people can connect with you further if they want to?
Yeah, thanks, Jez. So the best place to connect with me, so I'm sure Jez will put a link in the show notes. If you go to Solas, SOLAS is the ministry I run, based in Scotland, SOLAS-cpc.org. That's our website, and there you'll find a number of
Super. Thank you so much. And thank you for your generosity in making all of that available for free for people to use. I'm also excited because I believe you're going to be joining us at the New Day Youth Festival in the summer as well.
Yeah, I'm hugely looking forward to it. I confess my ignorance. I didn't even know about that festival till you guys asked. I do a lot of festivals across the summer, but this is a new one. So yeah, looking forward to there. So if I've said something folks have enjoyed, they can come talk to me more. If I've said something totally outrageous and all the vegans want to come and throw avocados at me, you will know where I am.
Excellent. Well, that's one reason to come to the summer, if nothing else, to see avocados thrown at Andy Bannister. Thank you for your time. God bless you, and we'll see you again soon.